For most of galactic history, the outer frontier had never been important. The great empires of the galaxy focused on the rich inner systems where trade lanes overlapped and resources were abundant. Ancient civilizations controlled clusters of hundreds of worlds, each protected by fleets powerful enough to shatter entire star systems. Their maps were filled with glowing networks of commerce, military routes, and fortified territories. Far beyond those regions existed a thin scatter of colonies belonging to a much younger species: humans. On most star charts, human territory looked insignificant. A handful of distant systems sitting far from the valuable trade corridors. Sparse populations. Modest infrastructure. Limited fleets. To the powerful civilizations that dominated the galaxy, human space appeared to be little more than a quiet buffer zone between major powers. And because it seemed so unimportant, it was largely ignored. The alien empires had their own problems to worry about. Long-standing rivalries constantly erupted into costly wars. Entire armadas were spent fighting over border systems and resource-rich sectors. Fleets clashed, alliances formed and collapsed, and the political landscape of the galaxy shifted every few decades. Through all of it, human space remained quiet. Human diplomats rarely involved themselves in major galactic disputes. Their colonies focused on trade, mining, and expansion along the frontier. Cargo traffic slowly increased between their scattered worlds. New orbital stations appeared around distant planets. Asteroid belts were filled with industrial platforms extracting metals and rare materials. To outside observers, it looked like normal development for a growing civilization. No one saw any reason to investigate further. But while the galaxy fought its endless wars, humanity was doing something different. Every mining station built in an asteroid belt was designed with far stronger structural frameworks than necessary for simple industrial work. Beneath the visible machinery were hidden power grids and reinforced compartments that could house far more than mining equipment. Cargo freighters moving between colonies were built with modular interiors. Officially, they transported supplies and raw materials across human territory. Unofficially, their hulls were constructed to support rapid weapon installation and fighter deployment systems if ever required. Orbital trade stations quietly expanded year after year. Docking ports multiplied. Storage sectors grew deeper. Energy output increased far beyond what normal commerce demanded. None of this appeared suspicious from the outside. Growing civilizations naturally expanded their infrastructure as their populations increased. And humanity made sure everything they built had a perfectly reasonable explanation. The truth was hidden inside the details. Mining lasers powerful enough to cut through asteroid cores could easily be redirected toward enemy warships. Cargo vessels capable of long-range hauling could just as easily deploy strike craft from concealed hangars. Civilian stations orbiting quiet frontier worlds could transform into defensive platforms with only minor modifications. But none of those systems were activated. Not yet. Generations passed while humanity continued building quietly along the edge of the galaxy. Colonies multiplied across distant systems. Industrial output steadily increased. Freight networks expanded farther into the frontier. To the alien empires watching from afar, nothing about it looked threatening. Humanity appeared patient. Focused on survival and steady growth rather than power. That assumption became one of the greatest strategic mistakes in galactic history. Because while the powerful civilizations of the galaxy measured strength in fleets and visible firepower, humanity understood something far more useful: preparation. Every piece of infrastructure built across the frontier had a second purpose. Every colony had contingency plans that had been refined for decades. Civilian organizations quietly coordinated with military planners behind layers of bureaucracy and commercial activity. And all of it was designed around one simple idea. If the day ever came when a powerful empire decided to claim human territory, they would not be facing a young and unprepared civilization. They would be walking directly into a battlefield humanity had been constructing for generations. The galaxy simply never imagined that day would arrive. Because from their perspective, human space was insignificant. Quiet. Empty. not worth the attention of empires that controlled thousands of stars. But the more humanity was ignored, the more freedom they had to build without interference. No spies were sent to study their infrastructure. No fleets patrolled their borders closely. No councils debated their long-term intentions. Human space became the one region of the galaxy where no one bothered to look too carefully. And in that silence, humanity prepared for a future conflict that everyone else believed would never happen. By the time the galaxy finally decided to pay attention to the frontier, the quiet colonies scattered among those distant stars would no longer be simple outposts of a young civilization. They would be something far more dangerous. A network of hidden defenses. A fleet disguised as commerce. An entire region of space waiting for the moment it would finally be tested. And humanity had spent centuries making sure that when that moment arrived, the galaxy would already be far too late to stop what came next. For the Zarathi Dominion, expansion had always been simple. When the Dominion needed resources, they took new systems. When supply routes became vulnerable, they secured new territory. For centuries their fleets had pushed outward across the galaxy, absorbing weaker civilizations and claiming frontier regions without serious resistance. Their military doctrine was built on overwhelming force and absolute confidence. But recent wars had changed their priorities. A long conflict with a rival empire had drained enormous resources. Entire fleets had been destroyed. Shipyards were operating constantly to replace lost warships. The Dominion's industrial core could still support the war effort, but their supply chains were stretched thin. Strategists began searching for nearby systems that could provide stable resources and secure logistical corridors. Human space immediately appeared on their maps. It sat directly along the edge of several Dominion trade lanes. The region contained multiple mining colonies and expanding orbital infrastructure. Even better, human territory was politically isolated. No major alliances protected them, and their military strength seemed limited compared to the ancient empires surrounding them. To the Dominion High Command, the solution looked obvious. They would claim the frontier. The plan did not require a massive invasion. Dominion intelligence reports described human defenses as light and decentralized. Their fleets were scattered across distant systems with no major concentrations of power. A small expeditionary fleet would be more than enough. The goal was simple. Enter human space, establish military authority over a few key systems, and convert the existing infrastructure into Dominion supply hubs. Humanity would either submit peacefully or be forced to accept the new reality. Either outcome benefited the Dominion. So the fleet was assembled. Dozens of warships formed the expeditionary force. Cruisers, escort vessels, and logistics carriers moved together under the command of experienced officers who had spent decades fighting real wars against far stronger opponents than humans. To them, this mission felt almost trivial. They crossed the border into human territory expecting protests, perhaps some diplomatic complaints, but little real resistance. Instead, they encountered something unexpected. Normal activity. Cargo ships continued moving between colonies exactly as they always had. Mining platforms operated deep within asteroid belts. Civilian communications transmitted routine traffic reports and trade updates. There were no emergency alerts. No defensive fleets moving to intercept. No mobilization signals across human space. Dominion commanders studied the data and quickly reached the same conclusion. The humans had chosen not to resist. Some officers even joked that the frontier might be secured without firing a single shot. After all, weaker civilizations often surrendered the moment a superior fleet arrived. As the expeditionary force advanced deeper into human territory, the silence continued. Cargo convoys passed nearby without altering course. Orbital stations maintained their regular docking schedules. Colonies broadcast calm civilian communications as if nothing unusual was happening. The Dominion fleet spread out slightly to prepare for occupation procedures. And that was when the first anomaly appeared. One of the nearby cargo convoys suddenly altered its formation. At first it looked like a simple navigation adjustment. Freight ships occasionally reorganized their positions during long journeys. But Dominion sensors soon noticed something strange. The hull sections of several cargo vessels began shifting. External panels opened along their sides. Large mechanical structures extended outward from compartments that had not previously existed. The transformation happened in seconds. What had looked like harmless freight carriers unfolded into heavily armed warships. Hidden weapon batteries rotated into firing positions. Missile launchers emerged from concealed bays. Energy reactors surged as dormant combat systems powered to full capacity. At the same moment, dozens of mining platforms scattered across the nearby asteroid belt began activating previously hidden equipment. Massive drilling lasers redirected toward the Dominion fleet. Asteroid stations that had appeared purely industrial opened armored hangars filled with strike craft. Orbital trade hubs shifted configuration as defensive shields powered on, and heavy weapons emerged from beneath their outer structures. Across multiple systems, the same transformation began. Human civilian infrastructure was turning into something else entirely. Dominion commanders suddenly realized the silence they had interpreted as surrender had actually been preparation. Within minutes, thousands of hidden weapons were targeting their ships. The quiet frontier had just revealed its true purpose. And the trap was already closing. The Dominion fleet reacted immediately, but they were already too late. Combat alarms spread across every ship as targeting systems suddenly filled with hundreds of hostile signatures. What had appeared moments earlier as harmless civilian infrastructure was now a coordinated military network surrounding them from every direction. The first human attack came without hesitation. Missile swarms erupted from converted cargo vessels, streaking through space in tightly guided formations. At the same moment, asteroid mining platforms redirected their massive drilling lasers toward Dominion cruisers. The beams, designed to cut through kilometers of solid rock, tore directly through warship armor. Dominion captains attempted to reorganize their fleet into defensive formation, but the battlefield was already collapsing around them. Human strike craft launched from hidden hangars inside asteroid bases and orbital stations. Hundreds of small fighters moved in coordinated attack patterns, targeting shield generators and sensor arrays before the Dominion ships could lock onto them. Then the next problem appeared. Dominion communications began failing. Signals between ships were suddenly filled with interference. Targeting data became unreliable. Navigation systems produced conflicting coordinates. At first, the commanders assumed human jamming technology was responsible. But the disruption was far more precise than standard electronic warfare. Hidden relay satellites scattered throughout the frontier activated simultaneously, flooding Dominion systems with corrupted signals specifically designed to overload their combat networks. Human engineers had anticipated the arrival of foreign fleets long before this moment. Every relay tower, communication buoy, and monitoring satellite in the region had been designed with this exact scenario in mind. The Dominion fleet was not just surrounded. It was blind. Individual warships attempted to fight independently, but that only made the situation worse. Without coordination, their formations broke apart as captains tried to evade incoming fire and regain stable sensor readings. Human forces exploited the chaos instantly. Strike groups focused first on Dominion logistics ships positioned behind the main formation. Missile volleys ripped through the slower vessels carrying fuel reserves and supply modules. Within minutes, several of the fleet's most important support ships were destroyed. Next came the command cruisers. Human fighters swarmed the larger vessels, targeting communication arrays and bridge sections with surgical precision. Without their central coordination hubs, the Dominion warships were reduced to scattered combat units struggling to survive inside a battlefield they could barely understand. Then the mining lasers fired again. Massive beams carved through two Dominion destroyers attempting to regroup near an asteroid belt. Their shields collapsed under the concentrated energy, and their hulls split apart under sustained impact. Panic began spreading through the remaining Dominion crews. These were experienced soldiers who had fought powerful enemies before, but this situation felt entirely different. They had expected resistance from a young civilization with limited capabilities. Instead, they had entered a region of space that had been quietly transformed into a fortress. And every piece of that fortress was now attacking them. Human forces did not rush recklessly. Their movements followed a precise pattern that became clearer as the battle progressed. Supply ships were destroyed first. Command vessels were isolated next. Then individual warships were surrounded and eliminated one by one. Within hours, the Dominion expeditionary fleet was collapsing. Some ships attempted desperate retreats toward the border, accelerating away from the expanding human defense network. A few managed to escape the battlefield with heavy damage. Most did not. By the time the last Dominion cruiser fell silent, the entire expeditionary force had been effectively erased. Human losses were minimal compared to the scale of destruction inflicted on the invaders. Across the frontier, converted civilian infrastructure slowly powered down its weapons and returned to normal operations. Cargo ships folded their launch bays back into sealed compartments. Mining stations redirected their lasers back toward asteroids. To an outside observer, the region would soon look quiet again. But the surviving Dominion ships carried something far more dangerous than damage reports back toward their empire. They carried the truth. Human space had never been weak. For generations it had been preparing for exactly this moment. And the battle that had just destroyed an entire Dominion fleet was not humanity's response to the invasion. It was simply the signal that activated the next phase of their strategy. Because while the Dominion was still trying to understand what had just happened on the frontier, something else had already begun far beyond the battlefield. Humanity's second strike was already moving. The surviving Dominion ships reached their territory carrying fragments of a disaster no one wanted to believe. Initial reports described hidden weapons, civilian infrastructure turning into war platforms, and a frontier that had somehow transformed into a massive defensive network. Dominion analysts struggled to process the information. Human space had never shown signs of building fleets large enough to destroy an entire expeditionary force. The High Council immediately called for retaliation. Emergency mobilization orders spread through Dominion territory. Shipyards accelerated production schedules. Admirals began gathering larger battle groups capable of crushing human resistance once and for all. But before those fleets could even depart, something far worse began happening. Supply depots in multiple Dominion systems suddenly exploded without warning. Fuel reserves ignited in perfectly timed chain reactions that destroyed entire orbital storage facilities. At first, the incidents were treated as accidents. Then long-range communication arrays started failing across several sectors. Relay towers that carried military signals between fleets went silent one after another. Navigation satellites stopped responding. Defense grids on several industrial worlds abruptly shut down for reasons technicians could not explain. The Dominion had faced sabotage before, but never at this scale. Entire logistical networks began collapsing within hours. Cargo shipments vanished from tracking systems. Docking platforms refused to respond to command signals. Automated security programs inside shipyards locked out their own engineers. Confusion spread rapidly through the Dominion military. Admirals preparing their retaliation fleets suddenly discovered that their supply chains were breaking apart. Fuel deliveries were delayed or destroyed. Communication routes were unreliable. Strategic coordination between distant sectors became nearly impossible. Investigators rushed to identify the source of the disruptions. What they discovered made the situation even worse. For decades, Dominion trade networks had quietly relied on human contractors and engineering firms. Human cargo companies transported materials across long routes between empires. Human technicians helped install maintenance systems in remote relay stations where Dominion specialists rarely traveled. At the time, it had seemed harmless. Humans were considered a minor civilization, useful for labor and logistics but far too weak to threaten the Dominion. No one questioned why their technology had slowly spread through so many infrastructure systems. Now investigators were discovering hidden protocols buried deep inside those systems. Dormant command routines. Silent access pathways. Programs that had remained inactive for years. Until the moment they were activated. Humanity had not only prepared their frontier for invasion. They had quietly studied the Dominion itself. Every trade contract, every engineering partnership, Every maintenance project had placed small pieces of human technology inside critical Dominion infrastructure. When the Dominion fleet crossed into human space, those hidden systems received a signal. Across dozens of star systems, they awakened simultaneously. Communication networks shut down. Defense platforms powered off. Supply depots lost safety controls. Entire logistics chains collapsed from within. While Dominion leadership struggled to stabilize their own territory, new sensor reports began arriving. Unknown fleets were appearing near several strategic worlds. These ships were not large invasion armadas. They were smaller, faster human strike groups moving with precise coordination. And they were targeting locations whose defenses had already gone silent. Industrial planets surrendered within hours after their orbital shields failed. Fuel depots were captured before local forces could organize resistance. Several Dominion shipyards were seized while their own security systems remained locked. The attacks were not random. They targeted the exact systems required to support a major military retaliation. By the time Dominion commanders understood the pattern, their empire had already lost control of several critical sectors. The galaxy watched the unfolding crisis in stunned silence. For generations, humanity had appeared cautious, distant, and politically unimportant. Their colonies existed quietly along the edge of known space while ancient civilizations fought their endless wars. Now the truth was impossible to ignore. Humanity had spent centuries observing the galaxy, learning its systems, studying the habits of empires that believed themselves untouchable. While others displayed power openly through massive fleets and constant expansion, humans had built something far more patient. A strategy that relied on preparation, timing, and the arrogance of those who underestimated them. The Dominion had believed it was launching a simple territorial expansion. Instead, it had triggered a plan that had been waiting for generations. The destruction of their expeditionary fleet had never been the human response. It had only been the first signal. By the time the Dominion realized how deeply human influence had spread through their empire, the damage was already done. Human fleets were moving freely through weakened defenses. Critical worlds were changing hands. And the balance of power across the frontier was shifting faster than any empire could react. The quiet region of space once dismissed as insignificant had suddenly become the center of the most devastating strategic offensive the galaxy had ever witnessed. Because while the empires of the galaxy were busy ignoring human space, humanity had been preparing for the moment they would finally be noticed. And by the time they realized the truth, humans had already struck again.